Upper Peninsula, Michigan, August, 1886. The air, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, carried the rhythmic scrape of a trowel and the soft thud of wood on mortar. Andre Mazur worked alone, his back a taut line of concentration against the vast, indifferent forest. He wasn't raising a wall of horizontal logs, notched and chinked in the time-honored way of the frontier. He was building something altogether different, something that drew stares and, soon, mockery. His walls rose in a strange mosaic of circles. He was laying short lengths of cedar, 16 inches long, with their circular ends facing out like a honeycomb of severed branches. Between each piece, he packed a thick, pale mortar. It looked less like a house and more like a woodpile that had been clumsily glued together. Harlan Pike, foreman of the largest logging outfit in the county, stopped his horse on the trail above Mazur's clearing. Pike was a man whose authority came from competence. He knew timber from root to rafter, and what he saw in the clearing offended his professional sensibilities. He wasn't a malicious man, but he was a practical one. And this was impractical foolishness. "What in God's name is that, Mazur?" Pike's voice boomed across the clearing, carrying the easy confidence of a man who was never wrong about the properties of wood. Andre placed another log end into the mortar, nudging it level. He looked up, his face calm. "A wall, Mr. Pike." Jedediah Stone and Caleb Finch, two settlers who had been convinced to stop by the foreman, chuckled from their wagon. "Looks more like you're stacking next winter's firewood, Andre," Jedediah called out. "Trying to season it before you burn it?" Pike dismounted and walked closer, his boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. He squinted at the construction, running a hand over the rough bark of the log ends. "You've got air gaps the size of a squirrel's nest in that mortar. You've got exposed end grain that'll soak up every drop of rain and rot out by spring. This isn't a wall. It's firewood you've glued into a wall." He turned to the others. "The man's building a home out of kindling. He's a fool." The word hung in the air, sharp and definitive. In a land where a sturdy home was the only line between life and a frozen death, fool was the gravest of accusations. Andre Mazur simply picked up his trowel, scraped a wedge of mortar from his hock, and laid the next piece of wood. The mockery would last through the autumn. The validation would have to wait for the cold. What did this quiet Polish cooper, a maker of barrels, understand about the physics of conduction that a master logging foreman and a community of experienced frontiersmen had missed? Before we unpack the intricate science that turns a woodpile into a thermal fortress, take a moment to subscribe to this channel and ring the bell for notifications. In the next few minutes, I promise you will learn exactly how the orientation of wood grain can become a powerful barrier against the cold, a secret hidden in plain sight. And let us know in the comments, have you ever seen a cordwood house? And what did you think of it? Andre Mazur was not a carpenter. He was not a logger, a farmer, or a frontiersman. He was a bednarz, a cooper, from the Kashubian Lake District of Poland, a land of rolling hills and deep, cold winters. His hands, calloused and knowing, were not trained to swing a broadaxe or notch a saddle joint. They were trained in the precise and demanding art of shaping oak staves with a draw knife, of hammering steel hoops onto a barrel with a cooper's adze, of understanding the subtle language of wood grain under tension. His world had been one of charring fires to bend the wood, of the sweet, sharp smell of curing oak, of the perfect geometry required to make a vessel that could hold liquid without leaking a single drop. He thought of wood not as a structural beam, but as a container. He and his wife Zofia had come to America with their two children, Kazimierz and Aniela, seeking land and a life they could build with their own hands. They arrived in the Upper Peninsula with little more than their savings and Andre's tools. They had bought their plot of land, and with the help of neighbors, erected a standard log cabin just before their first winter, a structure identical to every other in the settlement. That first winter of 1885 had been a lesson in humility and terror. The cabin, which had seemed so robust in the mild autumn, became a sieve for the cold. The single-plank walls, chinked with mud and moss, bled heat as fast as the stove could produce it. By midnight, the fire would have burned down to a bed of sullen coals, and the temperature inside would begin its relentless plunge. Andre and Zofia would wake to the sound of their own shivering, piling every blanket and coat they owned onto their sleeping children. In the mornings, a delicate lacework of frost would cover the inside of the walls, a beautiful and deadly flower blooming in their home. The water in the bucket by the door would be filmed with ice, and Zofia's heart would seize with a cold fear that had nothing to do with the temperature. She watched her children, their faces pale, their breath pluming in the air of their own bedroom, and prayed for a dawn that seemed to take an eternity to arrive. They survived, but only just. Andre spent that winter not just cutting firewood, but studying his house. He watched where the frost formed first. He felt the drafts with the back of his hand. He saw the chinking shrink and crack, opening up dozens of tiny mouths that drank the warmth from the room. He realized the problem wasn't the fire. The problem was the walls. They were built like highways for the cold. He remembered his father, also a cooper, telling him how the end grain of a barrel stave, the circular face, was the tightest and most water-resistant part. Water, like heat, struggled to pass through it. An idea born in the workshops of the old world began to take shape in the brutal classroom of the new. He would not build another highway. He would build a barrier. The failure of the conventional log cabin in the face of a Michigan winter was not a matter of poor craftsmanship. It was a matter of physics. The settlers of the Upper Peninsula were skilled builders, using methods proven for centuries. But those methods were developed in climates less savage than the one they now faced, where the proximity to Lake Superior created a uniquely punishing cold. The problem was conduction. Heat, like any form of energy, seeks equilibrium. It moves from a warmer area to a cooler one, and it will always take the easiest path available. In a traditional log cabin, that path was terrifyingly direct. A log, hewn and placed horizontally, presents its long grain to the interior and exterior. Think of wood grain as a massive, tightly packed bundle of microscopic straws. Heat energy travels down the length of these straws with remarkable ease. A single log in a wall acts as a thermal bridge, a direct conduit from the warm interior to the frozen world outside. A study of northern white cedar, the very wood they used, shows that heat conducts along the grain, from end to end, nearly 3 times more efficiently than it does across the grain. The entire wall of a standard cabin was, in thermal terms, pointing the wrong way. The chinking between the logs, typically a mix of mud, moss, clay, or horsehair, was an even weaker link. As the green logs dried and shrank over their first winter, the chinking would crack and pull away, creating countless fissures for cold air to infiltrate. Even the best-maintained chinking had a much lower insulating value than the wood itself. Every horizontal line on a log cabin was a seam of thermal weakness. The families surrounding the Mazur plot were living this reality every day. The Finches, Caleb and his wife Mary, burned through a cord of wood every 10 days, a staggering rate of consumption that kept Caleb in the woodlot from dawn till dusk. Their children were perpetually sick, with coughs that rattled in the thin air of their cabin. Silas Grant, a trapper who lived a quarter-mile down the trail, had lost 2 of his pack horses one night when they froze, standing in their lean-to, a structure built with the same techniques as his house. The physical proof of failure was everywhere. Inside these cabins, The laws of thermodynamics were a ruthless landlord. A roaring fire might raise the temperature to 60 degrees Fahrenheit near the hearth, but in the corners of the same room, it could be a mere 40 degrees. The single layer of wood simply couldn't hold the heat. It radiated out into the sub-zero air almost as quickly as the fire could generate it. The settlers weren't heating their homes. They were merely fighting a losing battle to warm the entire Michigan wilderness, one armload of firewood at a time. Andre began his work in the late summer, giving himself months before the first frost. He did not need the massive, straight timbers required for a traditional cabin, the kind that Harlan Pike's crews specialized in felling and hauling. He needed something the loggers considered waste, sections of cedar trunks that were too short, too crooked, or too narrow for the sawmill. He could buy them for pennies on the dollar. He spent weeks with a cross-cut saw, methodically slicing the logs into uniform 16-inch lengths. His woodpile grew not with long timbers, but with thousands of identical wooden discs. His wife Zofia watched with a quiet apprehension. "It does not look like a house, Andre," she said one afternoon, her hands twisting in her apron as she looked at the first few courses of his strange wall. "The neighbors, they talk." "It will be warm," he replied, his voice calm and certain. He did not say more. He did not need to. Zofia had seen the look in his eyes during the worst nights of the previous winter, a look of fierce, protective determination. She trusted that look more than she trusted the opinions of their neighbors. The mortar was his own invention, a recipe born of necessity and knowledge. He knew he needed a binder, but cement was expensive and hard to acquire. Lime was more common. He mixed lime putty with sand for strength, but then he added a crucial third ingredient: sawdust. Piles of it were left to rot at every logging camp. To the settlers, it was useless debris. To Andre, it was an insulator. He knew that the tiny air pockets trapped within the sawdust would disrupt the flow of heat through the mortar itself, just as the wood fibers did. His mortar wasn't just a glue. It was an integral part of the insulation system. It was a thick, fibrous, and remarkably insulating mixture. He laid the foundation of fieldstone just as any builder would. Then he began the walls. He would lay down a thick bed of his sawdust mortar, 2 parallel beads with a gap in the middle. Into this bed, he would press the cordwood rounds, wiggling them into place until they were secure. He would then fill the gaps between the logs with more mortar, pointing it neatly on the inside and outside. The gap in the middle of the mortar bed was another deliberate innovation, a cavity filled with loose sawdust, a complete thermal break running the length of the wall. Harlan Pike made a second visit in September. This time it was official. Andre had requested to purchase a small load of coal logs, and Pike had come to finalize the order and, he admitted to himself, to get another look at the foolishness. He saw the walls were now waist-high. "Mazur," Pike said, keeping a professional distance. "I came about your timber request. My men are on a schedule for the winter camps. I can't spare the manpower to haul stove lengths to you. It's not cost-effective." The message was clear. This project was not worthy of his crew's time. It was a professional dismissal. "I can haul them myself," Andre said, not looking up from his work. He was checking the plumb of the wall with a weighted string. Pike shook his head, a mix of pity and frustration on his face. "You're wasting your time and your money. That wall will drink water like a sponge. The mortar will freeze, expand, and shatter. And the whole damn thing will come down on your family. Build a proper house, man." Andre paused. He looked at Pike, his eyes steady. "This will be a proper house." He turned back to his wall, picked up a cedar round, and set it into the mortar. The conversation was over. Pike, having delivered his expert warning, turned and left, convinced he would be helping to dig the Mazur family out of a frozen pile of rubble come January. The genius of Andre's wall was its elegant defiance of conduction. To understand why it worked so well, one must first understand the journey of heat. Heat energy, measured in British thermal units or BTUs, is simply the vibration of molecules. In a solid material like wood, these vibrations are passed from one molecule to its neighbor. Conduction is the transfer of heat through this direct contact. In a conventional log wall, where the logs are laid horizontally, the grain of the wood, the long, hollow cellulose fibers that carry water up the tree, are also horizontal. Imagine these fibers are tiny, parallel pipelines. When heat from the stove hits the interior wall, it enters these pipelines and travels straight along them to the cold exterior face. The path is long, but it is unobstructed. The R value, a measure of thermal resistance for a typical 8-inch cedar log laid this way, is around 10. Serviceable, but not exceptional. Andre's Cordwood wall completely re-engineered this pathway. By placing the logs with their ends facing out, he forced the heat to travel across the grain, not along it. Instead of a journey down an open pipeline, the heat now had to fight its way sideways, jumping from fiber to fiber, through countless cell walls and tiny trapped air pockets. These air pockets are the key. Air is a poor conductor of heat, and wood is full of it. End-grain wood presents a chaotic, labyrinthine path for heat energy. The journey is no longer a straight shot. It's a torturous, slow crawl. The effective R value of his 16-inch thick cedar wall wasn't just double that of an 8-inch log wall. It was exponentially higher. With the insulating mortar and the sawdust-filled cavity, the total R value of his wall assembly approached R24, a level of performance unheard of in 1886, and one that would be respectable even in modern construction. Furthermore, the mortar matrix created a massive thermal break. In a standard cabin, every log is a bridge for heat to escape. In Andre's wall, each piece of wood was an island of high insulation, surrounded by a sea of moderately insulating mortar. There was no single easy path for heat to follow. It was forced to navigate a complex maze of wood and mortar, losing energy at every turn. Harlan Pike's criticism about the end grain absorbing water was valid in theory, but Andre had accounted for it. He had built wide, 2-foot eaves on his roof, which would keep most rain and snow melt from ever touching the walls. And the lime mortar itself had a property Pike didn't appreciate. It was breathable. Any moisture the wood did absorb could slowly evaporate back out through the mortar joints, preventing the buildup of damp that led to rot. Pike saw a pile of firewood. Andre saw a sophisticated thermal assembly, a system where every component worked together to slow the relentless march of BTS toward the cold. He had built a wall that worked like a dam, not a sieve. That December, winter fell upon the Upper Peninsula not like a blanket, but like a hammer. A vast mass of Arctic air, super chilled by its passage over the Canadian Shield, collided with the relatively warmer, moisture-laden air over Lake Superior. The result was a lake effect freeze of historic severity. For 16 consecutive nights, the temperature plunged below -20 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind was a physical presence, a blade that stripped heat from any surface it touched. The sound of trees in the forest cracking from the cold was like intermittent rifle fire. For the settlers in their conventional cabins, it was a state of siege. The world shrank to the small circle of warmth around the stove. At the Finch homestead, Caleb and his 2 oldest sons worked in shifts, feeding the ravenous cast-iron stove. The metal glowed a dull cherry red, yet the far corners of their single room remained brutally cold. Mary Finch had hung blankets over the doorways and windows, but they did little to stop the insidious creep of the frost that now coated the lower 2 feet of their interior walls. It was a thick, crystalline crust of ice, formed from the moisture of their own breath freezing the instant it touched the frigid logs. Their reality was one of constant labor, of huddled bodies, and the gnawing anxiety of a dwindling woodpile, A different reality existed inside the strange, circular walls of the Mazur home. The fire in their smaller stove was kept low, a steady, gentle burn. The warmth it produced did not flee. It stayed soaking into the immense thermal mass of the cordwood walls. It was minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit outside, but a comfortable and even 68 degrees Fahrenheit throughout their single large room. The contrast between the two worlds was stark, and best captured not by numbers, but by a simple domestic act. In the evening, as the wind howled outside, Zofia sat in a chair away from the stove, a basket of mending in her lap. By the light of a single kerosene lamp, she was darning one of Casimir's socks. Her fingers were not stiff or blue with cold. They were nimble and sure. The needle moved with easy grace, and the thread unspooled without a snag. The air was so still and dry that the lamp flame burned without a flicker. On a small table beside her, a pat of butter sat in a ceramic dish. It was soft. This small detail was the most profound proof of all. In every other cabin for 50 miles, butter was a frozen rock kept as close to the fire as possible. Here it was simply butter, ready to be spread on the warm bread that had baked in their oven that afternoon. They were not surviving. They were living. Andre sat at the table, carving a small wooden horse for Aniela, the shavings curling onto the clean, dry floorboards. The house was quiet, warm, and safe. It was a container for life, holding back the vast, killing cold of the wilderness. Harlan Pike was a man under pressure. The extreme cold was threatening his entire winter operation. Axles on the timber sleds were seizing. The horses were weakening, and the men in the camps were burning through firewood at a rate that would exhaust their stockpiles by February. He was at his main camp, reviewing timber scales and supply orders, when he realized a discrepancy in a tally for cedar posts required for a mine shaft. The logs were stacked at a landing near the edge of the company's tract, not far from the Mazur property. Cursing the incompetence of his subordinates, he pulled on his heaviest coat and set out on horseback to verify the count himself. The ride was brutal. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, and his exposed cheeks felt tight and numb within minutes. As he neared the landing, he saw the smoke rising from the chimney of the Mazur cabin. He noted it idly. Not the thick, panicked plume of a fire being desperately stoked, but a thin, lazy wisp that spoke of a slow, steady burn. He finished his work at the landing, his fingers stiff and clumsy even in his thick gloves. On his way back, driven by a nagging, professional curiosity, he guided his horse off the main trail and towards the strange little house. He dismounted, the crunch of his boots on the snow unnaturally loud in the frozen stillness. He expected to see a house rimmed with frost, perhaps with smoke stains where the foolish mortar had already failed, but the walls looked sound, the log ends dusted with a fine layer of snow, the mortar joints clean and sharp. He walked to the north-facing wall, the one that took the brunt of the winter wind. He pulled off his right glove. He had to know. He reached out and placed his bare palm flat against the mosaic of wood and mortar. He braced himself for the vicious, biting cold he knew so well, the instant ache of frozen wood that felt like it was stealing the very life from his hand. But the shock he received was of a different kind. There was no bite. Instead, what he felt was a deep, resonant warmth. It was not hot, but it was unmistakably, impossibly warm. It was the feeling of life, of retained energy, radiating gently through the 16 inches of wood and mortar into his frozen skin. He pressed his hand harder, trying to comprehend the sensation. He moved his hand from a log end to a mortar joint and back again. The temperature was almost uniform. He stood there for a full minute, his bare hand pressed against the wall of the man he had called a fool, while the minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit air scraped at his back. The physical evidence transmitted directly to his nerve endings was undeniable and overwhelming. His entire lifetime of experience with wood had been upended in a single touch. He walked to the door and knocked. Andre opened it, and a wave of calm, stable warmth washed over Pike, a stark contrast to the thin, scorching heat of a bunkhouse stove. Pike's eyes took in the scene. The children playing on a rug on the floor, Zofia humming as she kneaded dough, the entire family in simple shirt sleeves. There was no frost on the walls. There were no huddled figures. There was only peace. Pike was not a man for apologies, but he was a man who respected results. He looked from the comfortable room to the strange, circular pattern of the wall. He finally understood. He looked at Andre, his expression one of pure, unadulterated professional respect. "You didn't build a wall, Mazur," Harlan Pike said, his voice quiet with revelation. "You built a dam for the heat." Harlan Pike's conversion was total and immediate. He was a practical man, and the implications of what he had felt and seen were staggering. The next day he returned to the Mazur cabin not with criticism, but with a notebook and a barrage of questions. How much wood did it take? What was the mortar mix? How long to build? Andre, a man who shared knowledge as freely as he had received it, answered every question without a hint of triumphalism. Pike's mind was already racing, calculating fuel savings in cords of wood and man-hours. His logging camps were voracious consumers of firewood, with each bunkhouse requiring its own full-time stove tender during a cold snap. That winter, he ordered one of his construction crews, under his direct supervision, to build a new tool shed at the main camp using the Mazur method. The men grumbled, calling it Pike's folly, but they followed orders. The results silenced them. The small cordwood shed, with no fire at all, stayed consistently 20 degrees warmer inside than the outside air, simply by retaining the heat from the men working within it. Pike then ordered a new 20-man bunkhouse to be built entirely of cordwood masonry. When it was completed, the fuel savings were astonishing. The new bunkhouse used less than a third of the firewood of its traditional log counterparts, while maintaining a more stable and comfortable interior temperature. The stove tender could fill the firebox before bed, and it would still be throwing heat in the morning. News in the North Woods traveled through the logging camps. They were the hubs of commerce, labor, and gossip. The story of Pike's Polish bunkhouse spread quickly. Loggers, trappers, and settlers who passed through the camp saw the structure, felt its warm, dry walls, and heard the foreman himself extolling its virtues. The proof was undeniable. By the following spring, the mockery that had surrounded Andre Mazur had transformed into a quiet stream of visitors. They came not to ridicule, but to learn. That summer, 12 new cordwood structures were built in the county, their distinctive circular walls a growing testament to an idea that had once been dismissed as madness. The technique spread organically, its adoption driven by the most powerful force on the frontier, practical, measurable success. The principles that Andre Mazur employed in his cordwood walls were decades ahead of their time. Without any formal training in physics or engineering, he had intuitively grasped concepts that would only become foundational to building science in the mid-20th century. His wall was a near-perfect example of a high thermal mass system. The dense wood and mortar absorbed the stove's heat slowly and released it slowly, creating a stable interior climate that resisted the wild temperature swings of the outside world. His use of a sawdust-filled cavity in the mortar was a direct forerunner of modern insulated wall cavities and the concept of a thermal break, a deliberate interruption in a conductive material to stop the flow of heat. Today, architects and builders use rigid foam, fiberglass, and complex air gaps to achieve the same effect that Andre created with lime and sawmill waste. His entire structure anticipated the principles of modern high-performance building, which emphasizes airtightness, continuous insulation, and the management of thermal bridging. The Polish cooper, working from the lessons of his ancient trade, had built a 19th century house that performed on a 20th century level. There is a simple truth hidden in the forests of the Upper Peninsula, a lesson written in wood and mortar. Knowledge is not always found in the places we expect. An expert logger, a master of his craft, knew how to fell a tree, how to move it, and how to build a strong structure from it. His knowledge was linear, direct, and powerful. But a cooper, a maker of barrels, possessed a different kind of wisdom. His entire craft was based on containment, on creating an impermeable vessel that held its contents secure from the world outside. He did not see a log as a beam to hold a roof, but as a barrier to hold a state of wine, of water, of warmth. When faced with the problem of a brutal winter, he did not ask how to build a stronger wall. He asked how to build a better barrel. The answers we find are determined by the questions we ask, and on the frontier, as in life, the path you cut decides how fast heat escapes. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this exploration of historical engineering and thermal physics valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories like this. Your support allows us to continue unearthing these forgotten innovations. And for our next discussion, tell us in the comments, what other unconventional building methods have you heard of, from the past or present? We look forward to reading your thoughts. The content of this video is for educational and storytelling purposes. It is a fictionalized reconstruction inspired by historical building practices. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are products of creative invention. The technical principles discussed are based on real-world physics and historical techniques, but any application of these or similar ratty methods in modern construction should be undertaken only after consulting with qualified professionals and in accordance with all current building codes, safety standards, and local regulations. This video does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.